So, Stormy, I have a question for you, and Kim too. What do you guys think ancient Egypt and the Michelin Man have in common? Can we guess? Any guesses?
Sorry.
Ask me that question, please. Tune into A Cleaner Future with Pollution Evolution.
We are your hosts,
Faith
and Kimberly, with our guest today, Stormy.
Hello, everybody.
You can follow us along on this journey on our Instagram at Pollution Evolution Podcast. And you can also listen to us on Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else you get your podcast. And we post Pollution Evolution every Saturday at 4 p.m. Central Standard Time. Welcome to episode 4 of the pod. We are Barbie girls in a polluted world. Today, we are going to be discussing the pollutant carbon black with our guest, Stormy.
So before we get started, Stormy, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, everybody. My name is Stormy, like Kim and Faith have said. I'm from a tiny town outside of Dallas, Texas, and I spent a lot of my life in a bunch of different environments. And so I've lived in Texas, I've lived in Arizona, out in the deserts, and I've lived in Wisconsin as well. And so I've seen a lot of crazy things in these places, and I have always kind of been interested in trying to figure out a lot more practical ways that I can just do my due diligence in making sure that I take care of the environment. So even though I am not as learned as I would like to be in the field of environmental science, I am still really interested in how I can just do my part on a daily basis. And just being around you and Kim, it makes things a lot easier and a lot more digestible. And so I really appreciate the fact that you guys really are taking the time to help.
That's why we're excited to have you on the pod today. For our listeners who don't know, Stormy actually is a cello player by trade, and she is a shining example of why we do pollution evolution. She has no background in environmental science, but she's learning and working with the environment each and every day to make it a better place, even if it's not her profession. And it just goes to show that you don't have to get a degree or dedicate your whole life to saving the environment. Simply just caring enough is all you need to do. Yeah. So, we're so excited to dive into this episode today and talk a little bit about carbon black because, oh man, this episode's going to be a doozy today. So let's jump right into it.
So the first question I wanted to ask is for Faith and Stormy. Stormy, I'd like you to go first. Do you know what carbon black is?
Would you believe me if I said yes? No, I do not.
Okay, what about you, Faith?
I do know what carbon black is, but for our viewers, I'm going to let Kim give us the full background because Miss Mama knows about it better than me and Stormy do because, as Kim mentioned, she is from Borger. That is one of their main industries.
Yeah, so carbon black, for those of you who don't know or haven't been around it, it is this black substance that you see. It's tiny, tiny particles. They're composed of mainly carbon, surprise, surprise. And there are various features of carbon black that are controlled in production based on how they combust the oil and the gases. So sometimes they have emissions that are going to be really high, but they do have filters in these places to try to prevent emissions from going out exorbitantly. So with that, let's go ahead and start with the history of carbon black.
So, Stormy, I have a question for you, and Kim too. What do you guys think ancient Egypt and the Michelin Man have in common? Can we guess? Any guesses?
Sorry.
Ask me that question, please. What do ancient Egypt and the Michelin Man have in common? Kim?
Well, before we put together this outline, if you would have asked me that, I would have said I have no idea.
My answer, I think, is that
he's an Egyptian king.
I was going to say they were both doing drag together.
I love it.
Maybe they're just they both do drag.
Yeah, maybe.
Because the Michelin Man's a drag. And ancient Egyptians that was daily living.
So they were not drag queens. But you were close. But actually, carbon black was actually first used in ancient Egypt and China to help write on papyrus and bamboo. That was one of the earliest usages of it. And then as we get into like the 15th century, you know, we are able to print books and begin that process. We start to use carbon black for inks and newspaper printing. When we really, really begin to see it start to freaking boom is in the 19th century. So the Michelin Man was created around this time, and he was first introduced in France, and he was white. And obviously we know tires are black now. I don't think anybody's ever seen a white tire, have y'all?
No.
And the reason why tires are now actually black is because we found out that if you can combine carbon black and rubber together in the 19th century, it actually makes a much more stable rubber and a much more durable, long-lasting product. And as we know, the automotive industry is booming now, and rubber components are needed. And so carbon black is constantly going to be in use. But in the 19th century, they obviously weren't aware of that. And this is actually a very dark time in the history of carbon black, because during this time, rubber was discovered in Africa. The tree called Landophia oriensis is a species of Lania from a family found in tropical Africa. Latex is extracted from this plant and actually used to make rubber. In the 19th century, King Leopold II from Belgium illegally annexed the Democratic Republic of Congo, or the DRC as we know now, and committed atrocities in the name of obtaining this material. He had absolutely no claim to this land. He actually illegally annexed it, and 10 million people wound up dying within this period of the late 19th century into the early 20th century. Realizing that carbon black actually stabilizes rubber increased this demand, and it directly fueled the genocide of the Congolese people. And even to today, there is still an ongoing genocide in the DRC that is being funded, again, by the resources in the area. And so as we discuss these things, we're not only talking about pollution and its health effects, but we're looking at the bigger picture and at these supply chains to recognize that it's not only domestically that is being hurting, but millions of people have been impacted throughout the global history for the acquisition of these goods and the usage of them.
Yes, and Stormy, what do you think? You know, now that you got the answer to what do they have in common, do you have any thoughts on what Faith just said?
Yes, I think it's very interesting and honestly ingenious and of an idea to use something like carbon black for ink and papyrus used for like historical documentation purposes.
Yes.
Like, as somebody who worked in a library for about 2 years, that is very, very cool.
Yes.
Being able to find out like how people actually recorded history and used certain materials, and were still able to preserve their lives, like do something with it.
And it gives us access to it now, too.
Yeah,
we get to see that,
Yeah, and I think whilst, yes, it's like a marvel of the time, I still find it kind of odd that we went from using it to record, in my opinion, like very important things, and then now it's being used en masse for vehicles and for automotive parts. And not only that, when we sit here and think about the full effects in our daily life of how we get to interact with this, we only get to know about this because people have had to go through all of these terrible things for us to have the phones to be able to look at all this information and do all of these things. Like, our access is coming off of the suffering of way too many other people, and it's not a secular issue, and it's not brand new, and we could find so many better things to do with it. And not only that, we could find much better ways to safely regulate this, and if it's not even safe for us to be around, period, find much safer alternatives.
better, cleaner,
Right.
and promote a better future for us all instead of dooming us. I want to talk a little bit about the factors that are actually driving the development behind carbon black acquisition, because I don't know if you guys know right now, but the carbon black industry is rapidly growing throughout the U.S. And there are so many factors impacting that directly go with some of those issues we've been hitting on. And one of the very primary ones is the growing automotive industry. It is a major consumer of carbon black, and its demand is expected to grow because vehicle production is growing. Even if we have Teslas or other, various EVs, they still need tires. They still have rubber components that are using carbon black. Yes, they're eco-friendly, but how eco-friendly are they? The rubber is made through poisoning entire ecosystems in cities. Like, at what point do we stop and ask ourselves, like, is it actually eco-friendly, or is it friendly for our wallets? Another factor is the growing electronics industry. The demand for carbon black is also expected to grow because of the use of plastics in electric and electrical components. There is, again, an ongoing genocide. I know I keep mentioning this, but I just really want to highlight the fact that these materials, in order to access them, gross human rights violations must occur. And we need to, stop looking at, us just, going to the store and purchasing something and look past, how did it get there? Who was the person that had to mine, pick, grow, or do these things? What conditions did they work in? And am I contributing to a system of oppression and slavery or wage labor?
Yeah, because those issues aren't in the history anymore. They never were in history. They still have continued to exist, and it's important that we touch on these topics.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Our last factor that is driving this economic growth is actually growing need in infrastructure and infrastructure development. Carbon black is also essential for many construction purposes and many building uses. So those three reasons are why we continue to see the growing reliance on this technology, even though we know the harms that it does not only to nature and air and water quality and soil quality, but to overall human health and overall human rights. Now that we've discussed all those economic factors that are driving this growth, now I think we can really get into those uses and really dive in deeper and see exactly how the U.S. economy is fueling overall carbon black development and growth in our country and around the world.
So of these uses, there are tires, plastics, inks and coatings, and batteries. All of these use carbon black for its UV protection property. For tires, as Faith had mentioned before, they use carbon black for its reinforcement properties. It strengthens the rubber. And it also helps with heat conduction. It helps to transfer that heat away from the inner part of the tire so that it doesn't melt. For plastics, it adds color. So anything that you have that has a black coloring, it likely has carbon black in it. Plastics also use carbon black for its conductivity properties. So carbon black is able to conduct electricity, and it's useful for power cable shielding.
The last two uses of carbon black actually include inks and coatings and batteries. As we mentioned before, the conductivity and UV protection are the primary reason why they are used. And for inks, it also provides pigmentation, and in batteries, it allows conductivity. And now, Stormy, do you have any items in your house that are primarily black? Like spoons, bags, your trash cans, anything like that?
Let me think. My old cello case.
Oh, well, it very well might have.
Plastic.
Yeah, it very well might be.
My metal music stands, those are black. Let me think. What other things that I own?
Like kitchen spoons, too.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. Oh, yeah. Some black plastic spoons.
Yeah, you're more than likely being exposed to carbon black because that's what's giving it its pigmentation and its coloring, and you're cooking your food in that.
Yummy.
Yummy, yeah.
So does carbon black also go into the coloring on pots and pans, in plastic?
That's typically Teflon and PFAS, which we will be having an episode on forever chemicals, but that's typically the coatings that you see there, which are a whole other issue in and of themselves.
So the black plastic handles on them are also made with the Like, would they have carbon black?
Yeah, more than likely, but the coating itself on the pan would not, because it would melt if it's plastic.
Gotcha.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, and does this also affect textiles as well? Like, would your clothing be affected by this?
Yes, if it's made from plastic materials, and as we know, polyester, nylon, rayon, all of those are plastic. And so there is a potential for, yeah.
Well, I'm wearing carbon black right now.
Yeah.
Oh, and headphones.
Yeah, and just in a multitude of things. It's scary, right?
Yeah, my computer, my actual desktop, like the system, the PC itself.
Yeah, and those reasons, like, because of that level of exposure, that is the primary reason. This is actually tea, guys. The biggest reason why carbon black is facing restraints on the economy and with its growth is because of the harmful effects to the environment and also human health. And we are constantly surrounded by it. These effects are known. They're demonstrated. There is a multitude of research studies, and yet they continue to expose them to the general public who has no idea.
Broom bristles on, like, plastic brooms, too. I have a broom that has, like, black bristles, and that's plastic, too.
You're like, everything. It makes you think about everything in your house.
Fans, the little ribbon fans.
So now that we've discussed where this environmental pollutant is, let's talk about some of the health effects related to it. So firstly, we have respiratory effects. If you are being exposed to carbon black for short periods of time, you are going to experience coughing and worsened asthma. Over long periods of times, you could develop chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and you can also have decreased lung function. So for those of our viewers who know, whenever you go to the doctor, they check your oxygen. If that goes below 92, please go to a hospital, get seen. I am not a licensed doctor, but please go get seen. Just keep an eye on it. Know what your regular levels are. So secondly, we have cardiovascular issues, and it can increase your risk of heart attacks, stroke, hypertension, and all of these can be exacerbated if you already have pre-existing heart conditions. In addition to these cardiovascular effects, carbon black also has a carcinogenic potential, meaning that it can cause cancer. This mainly happens in industrial areas where your exposure is going to be high for a long period of time. There's also reproductive and developmental effects. So for women, you can have infertility and difficult pregnancy outcomes if you have been exposed to carbon black. And for your child, that carbon black can enter your placenta, and it can increase their risk of having respiratory infections, and it can have potential long-term impacts on their lung development. So in addition to all of this, it also has some systemic effects, meaning that it affects systems in your body. So the first thing it does is it causes inflammation. So it can cause organs such as your lungs to swell up and become bigger than they're supposed to be. It can also cause oxidative stress, which for those of you who remember, we talked about that in last episode, so I won't be going into it in detail here. It can cause immune system effects. So it can cause autoimmune disorders and increase your susceptibility to having infections. Next, it can have genotoxicity. So for those of you who remember our hexavalent chromium episode, it talked about DNA damage. Well, carbon black can also damage your DNA and cause genetic mutations. It also has neurological effects. There's research ongoing that has linked carbon black to Alzheimer's due to the inflammation it causes on the system, specifically on the brain, which is a key factor to the development of Alzheimer's. Also, the oxidative stress that it causes on your cells and your neurons in your brain. And then lastly, carbon black interrupts your blood-brain barrier for neurological effects. So your blood-brain barrier is a barrier there to prevent blood from going into your brain. But whenever that's knocked down by carbon black, you have no protection from blood entering your brain, leading to a host of issues. Next, we have endocrine disruption. So for those of you who are unaware, our endocrine system handles our hormones. So this can lead to endometriosis, PCOS, fibroids, irregular periods, and it can also cause diabetes, metabolic issues, In children, if you have been exposed at a young age, it affects your development. And in some children, it can actually cause you to have autism.
So I know that's kind of like a lot of information at once. Do you have any questions?
No. More so just processing the fact that something so widespread has all of these like deep effects on our bodies, and thinking about how it is changing us quite literally down to our genetic structure is honestly terrifying.
It is.
And there are just things that like you could do or use to make so many safer, easier, cheaper things that will last for much longer. But I think the most disheartening thing is that this was all from someone's choice.
Yeah.
Somebody else made this decision for all of us.
And now we have to deal with the fact that our endocrine system's being disrupted. We are at risk for all of these different life-altering diseases and illnesses, and a lot of them cause death or diminished quality of life. And this is what we have to look forward to.
I think that this would be a great time to talk about my first trip to Borger. So me and Kim were coming from the town that we had lived in previously. And on this drive, I was just admiring the earth around us because it's absolutely beautiful in Texas. Some parts, especially the part we were in, you can literally see for like 30, 40 miles any direction. And there's like rolling hills. It's so green. Or it's not really green. It's more red and like arid. And the skies are blue. And as we were driving in, we were just talking, and then all of a sudden I noticed that there was such a harsh change in the land. It was almost like a record scratch moment, because the land literally goes from red to dark black, and it looks like something horrible happened, like a disaster happened here. And I asked him, like, what the heck is going on here? Because it was so shocking to see such a difference in the environment and have no idea like why that was caused.
Yeah, and I remember on this trip, actually, as we're driving in, for those of you who know, there's some facilities outside of town before you enter. And as we started going near them, Faith told me, turn on the air circulation. Like, you really need to turn the air circulation. She starts freaking out. And I was like, what? I was like, what are you talking about? And she was like, it's that, do you not notice that smell? I said, that's the way the burger smells.
I said, why does it smell like sulfur dioxide?
Oh my gosh. And so I'm like, we're driving through with the air circulation on, which I now do every time that I'm in town. And she's like asking me, like, why does it look like this? And I was like, what do you mean? I was like, this is what it looks like. And it was in that moment we started having a conversation. Like, Faith was like, this isn't normal. It's not supposed to be like this. And in my little brain, like, I grew up seeing this. I grew up seeing, like, even black snow. So I was like, this is normal. Like, what are you talking about? Like, at this point, we had taken some college classes learning about pollution. And she was like, Kim, that stuff we talk about in class? Like, yeah, that's that right there. I didn't realize, you don't realize sometimes until you've had these conversations with people that what your normal is not actually normal.
So now that we've discussed a little bit about our experience in my first time in Kim's hometown, I want to show you some photos of some of the pollution sent in by our listeners and that have been taken by Kim. The first photo that I'm going to show Stormy is a photo of the town taken from a distance, and it's taken at sunset, and you can see a massive plume of carbon black coming out of the smokestack, and the plume is at least over like 100 meters from plume to stack. And then the next photo is a photo taken in daytime with a massive black cloud that's darkening the entire sky, and you can't really see anything. So what do you think about those first two that you've seen?
The first one, I think knowing that that's carbon black, that is crazy. It looks like there's a thunderstorm. Like this is completely covering the entire sky. I can tell that this is a consistent ongoing problem because it's daytime and there are street lamps on.
And then the next photo I'm showing Stormy is a photo of a smokestack on fire. And there are two plumes that are going upwards, and it is daytime, but there's huge black clouds covering the white. And I would like to mention all of these photos will be available on our Instagram at Pollution Evolution Podcast.
And it's crazy because below, like on the ground, it looks so not necessarily clear, but like almost just like barren and flat. And then as you start to look up towards the sky, you can tell where everything's starting to settle and how naturally darker the sky is getting because the ground looks much brighter than the sky directly above it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just the starting area of it.
Yep. And then our next photo is a large pile of snow outside of a store in town. And the snow pile looks like a pile of gravel or soil that has been stacked, but it is black snow.
This literally looks like somebody spilled out of a cement truck.
Mm-hmm.
Like, this looks like spillage from a truck. Like, This looks like cement.
Nope, just carbon black pollution. And that brings me into my next point. Carbon black has horrendous effects on the natural environment. As we mentioned before, it is used as a pigment in an ink. So if it's used to dye natural materials, you have to imagine what it's doing to the natural environment. And so carbon black pollution affects a multitude of areas. And I'm going to hit on water first. So one of our primary ways of having carbon black pollution is through surface water contamination. When there are carbon black facilities, their wastewater contains carbon black. Those plumes of smoke that are coming down come back down to the earth and settle into our water and go into our groundwater, and it ultimately contaminates aquatic ecosystems. And as that carbon black enters our surface water, it goes down to the bottom of the ponds, rivers, lakes, or streams, and it settles into the sediment. And there's a lot of little guys that live down there that will eat that sediment and exist there, and it begins to bioaccumulate in them. And that kind of brings me to my next point, bioaccumulation and biomagnification. So it talks about the fact that in animals, specifically aquatic creatures, carbon black can actually accumulate in their bodies over time and build up. As they go up the food chain, those concentration of carbon black gets higher and higher at each level of the food chain. So Stormy, here's a good example for you. So say there is carbon black that just got entered into the surface water. And it's going to float down to the bottom of the pond where all the sediment is. And then plants are going to uptake it in its roots, and it's going to be stored in the plant tissue. And over time, it's going to build up and build up and build up. And then say that plant is eaten by a fish in the pond, and that plant is its primary source of food. So then the carbon black begins to accumulate in the fish more and more and more. And you have to think about each time it's going from a different level, it's multiplying by a different factor each time, and it's growing exponentially. And then finally, say you just go along and you want to be a fisher girl. Like you're feeling frisky, you want to be like Katniss. So you go to the pond and you fish this fish and you eat it. Now that it enters your body, not only is it going to bioaccumulate if you continue to eat fish out of this, but the concentration that you're actually receiving is exponentially higher than that concentration that went into that lake because of biomagnification. So it just creates such a dangerous paradigm. When you're eating this food, we also have to think about the soil that it's being grown in as well, and especially in the area that you lived in, because soil can also be contaminated by carbon black. And carbon black also can alter soil pH, how many nutrients a plant can uptake and eat, and how the plant grows in the microbes that are around. And I don't know if y'all know, but all of those things directly impact growth and how much food can actually be grown. And we live in the breadbasket of the world. Like, our soils are so important and our soil health is so important. And without it, like, farmers have a much harder time getting good yields when the soil can't be healthy. But if there's pollution being carried by plumes hundreds of miles away, and farmers are like, what the heck is happening, and having no idea.
So in our air, whenever, specifically in the panhandle, there's high winds. Sometimes winds can be actually go up to 50 miles per hour, just on a regular day.
Lovely.
And so whenever there's high winds, think about how far dust can travel. Some of our listeners remember the Dust Bowl. That started in one area of the United States, and then it proceeded to take over an entire region. And that's the exact same thing that can happen, but some of these particles you can't see because they're so small. So you don't notice that they're transporting, but it could go not even just 1 hour away. There's wind currents that can carry dust from all the way in the Saharan desert to the United States. So that gives just an example of how important it is that we keep in mind it's not just your local community being impacted. And carbon black is also known as soot for our listeners, and it's formed by incomplete combustion. So I mentioned a little bit about the emissions that come from these plumes. So whenever I talk about incomplete combustion, that means that they don't burn whatever they're burning. So it's typically fossil fuels, waste, wood, things of that nature. And whenever they burn it, they can't burn it all the way, otherwise they don't have a product. So once they partially burn it, then everything that is not burned off is going out. So that can create carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, and volatile organic compounds. Volatile organic compounds we'll have an episode on, but essentially they are these also chemicals that react in the atmosphere. That's what makes them volatile. Carbon black, with all of these reactions, it actually has an impact on the climate because it can stay in the atmosphere for 4 to 12 days. It doesn't degrade naturally until around 4 to 12 days. Stormy, what do you think, now knowing how it impacts our environment? Do you have any thoughts?
It's very jarring to process that this is happening to a lot of people, and it's not even just us in our local communities. Like you guys said earlier, this is a worldwide issue. This has been an issue since well before we were born. And basically, it's just kind of crazy to think that not only is this the thing that is what we're actually having to process happening to us, but we also have to process the fact that this was based on someone else's choice. Somebody else, either today or a long time ago, made this decision, and it has now set us all up with potentially all of these issues or some of these issues. And when you think about certain types of effects and how this is pervasively affecting everybody, there's also probably a lot of diagnoses that people probably get because there's just so many this literally just is causing so many things for so many people in so many different ways. And thinking about my health issues, I don't even know if this could be potentially because of those same things or if this is something I would have had regardless or what, but that only shows me that there's more of a spotlight that, one, we can't do anything by ourselves, and two, our community is so important.
Let's talk about how we can fix this issue because it is a big issue and we can't just turn away. So, Faith, you know a little bit more about this than I do.
So, there's a lot of methods for carbon black remediation, and I would just like to add before I get into them, probably the biggest one, though, is if industries are using these things, getting air pollution control devices on their plumes, getting things like cyclones or airbags. And if you do those, Stormy, it can actually collect up to 90 to 99%, depending on the type of device that you're using, of these things before it even reaches the atmosphere. So I would definitely say just making sure that industries prioritize their air pollution control devices and making sure that they are staying within safe standards that the Environmental Protection Agency has set, and also the agencies in wherever city or country they operate in set, That would be my first line of defense. You can also help to reduce overall emissions of them, either by letting the government take action and allowing them to regulate, or by conducting research or swapping technologies using new things that are renewable, that are clean, and not steeped in genocide. And then lastly, you can use leaching processes. So you can either use chemical leaching or biological or microbial leaching, which is essentially using bacteria or microbes to remove the carbon black or using chemicals to remove it. All that to say is there are a lot of methods for reducing them. It's just the implementation of them that is the problem and the costliness.
It is a big environmental issue. It's not even just an environmental issue. It's a people, like a community issue. This stuff, like Faye said, I mean, I'm from a town where there's 2 of these facilities, and you can see a black mark on the town because of how much pollution there is. It's things like these that concern people with their health, and it concerns me for other people's health. You know, I've had people contact me, bless their souls, that they've had family members who have gotten double lung transplants or had cancer because they worked at some of these facilities with this pollution being inhaled consistently. So we just want everybody to know that if you are using carbon black products, anything black, anything that possibly is black plastic, even binders, like your school binders, just be careful what you're exposing yourself to, because there's a lot of bad things out there. And as we've discussed, not everybody knows what's going on with them.
Yes, 100%. Stormy, now that we've discussed carbon black, do you have any questions or concerns going forward about what this means for you in your future?
What would be a more practical way to transition from being so heavily reliant on a lot of these products to moving to something simpler? And I'm not talking like total grandiose plan. Like, what is a small step we could take like every day to just say, you know what? I'm either going to lessen my exposure or I'm going to eliminate my exposure from that area completely.
Yeah.
Because I'm thinking about like rice cookers. I'm thinking about pens.
Everything.
I'm thinking about all of these small things that we're not even realizing in passing, like our car keys, our key fobs are black plastic most of the time. And like, what are some ways that just in the tiniest, simplest of a start would be the greatest way to help you feel motivated to start this transition?
I think that's a great question. I'm actually excited that you asked this because I want to kind of talk on the small scale and move to the larger scale on this one. So smally, it is very overwhelming once you begin to realize, because we haven't even begun to touch on the other pollutants that we interact with day to day. And I know it can be very overwhelming, but my biggest philosophy is just start with one area in your life. So if that means, okay, I'm going to switch out all of my kitchen tools for bamboo, because personally for me, I prefer bamboo, glass, stainless steel, for my kitchen products, or clay ceramics with no coatings. We'll get into that on the PFAS episode why, but yeah. And so I would start off by switching out all of my plastic spoons, spatulas for alternatives like that. Or with your pens, you can switch to using pencils. You can find other inks that are not using carbon black in the processing. If you want to look at your cars, if you live in an area, you can start taking public transport. If you have the ability, I know we have a lot of rural listeners that don't have those options, but if you live in a larger city, you can take rails, you can take the bus, you can ride share, you can walk. So there's a lot of little things you can do. And I believe once you start in those one areas, it ripples to the rest of your life. Because at one point, me and Kim knew none of this. And it was us deciding to change one thing that caused the ripple effect to change our whole lives. So I believe our listeners will also have that effect if they can do that as well. But on the larger scale, I firmly believe that we can transition our economy to one of electrification and renewables. But I think it's going to start with the slow phasing out of these non-renewable resources. We cannot wake up and just be like, we are going to get rid of all the coal, all the oil. We very literally cannot do that. Our economy would crash. The world would crash because our electric systems rely on those things, but I do think that we can slowly start phasing them out each year, lessening the reliance on them, raising the reliance on renewables, so we have a natural, gradual shift towards full electrification. When I say electrification, I mean not using non-renewable resources.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's awesome because, yeah, like thinking about all of the tiny little things throughout my day-to-day life that I'm either consistently having to touch my body or I'm having to consistently interact with, I think is kind of wild to think about how pervasively and widely spread all of these types of materials are for our life. I think that it'll be a really, really great motivator once I kind of succeed after that first initial, like, getting rid of this. It'll be a lot easier to start getting rid of a lot of other things.
Exactly.
And, you know, like, those things can already help make such a big difference, and we don't have to talk about necessarily, right, like, transitioning from, like, a car-centric infrastructure over to, like, public transport and local community.
You just buy new spoons.
Right, like, I'm just buying new spoons.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so if those are, like, the small, tiny little transitions we can make throughout the day, it'll be a lot simpler for us to feel like there's hope and that we will succeed. And I just thought of that. Is there carbon black in cast iron? Like,
no, there's not. Like, cast iron's clean.
Okay.
Oh yeah, I meant to mention cast iron in my list. I forgot it, guys. Might be, but not all cast iron is good. But again, in the PFAS episode, we will go in more detail on our cookware.
As somebody who is not in this is nearly as you guys are, I think it's very motivating to get to hear how there are people outside of our own daily scope of existence actively working and thinking and finding ways to help us because it's a genuine matter of importance and we can see that people care. And it's good to see that if somebody else can just have basic empathy for the fact that I'm being exposed to these random chemicals outside of the fact that they're also being exposed, it makes me feel or think, why would I not also want to do that for someone else then? Why would I not want to help this process move along? Because it is affecting our health. It's affecting all of these things. Like, as Kim said, these heart conditions can get a lot worse if you already have pre-existing conditions. And I do. I have pre-existing heart conditions. And so, like, it's really important for me personally to find better ways, but it's also important for me to remember that whilst this is scary, that doesn't mean I have to be led by fear.
And you don't have to do it alone either, because the sad thing is it's not just us. You know, we've been exposed at a worldwide level, and that's why it's so important. We've always said community is so important because, you know, Stormy, you were sitting here. I could tell that you're aghast at some of the things that we said, like couldn't believe some of the things because it's devastating.
Yeah, it is.
But the important thing is to know, like you said, is, you know, there are people who care, and it's not just us. You know, everybody around the world right now is building community and finding the people that have the similar interests and trying to have conversations. And I think that's the biggest thing is, you know, Stormy, I want to thank you for being on here and for having a conversation with us because, you know, we get so deep into this sometimes that it's hard to be like, okay, what is actually useful out of all of this? Because it can be hard to listen to it's hard to read sometimes.
Yeah, and I also really appreciate and thank you guys for having me because I am somebody on the outside of this. Like, I really am not learned, and you guys are in the trenches with this information, and, like, still being able to be fueled by a sense of hope and community is honestly kind of the only thing that makes me think that I would be capable of making any form of change is because I'm seeing other people make this change and they're doing it together and it's less isolating and through love. And it's just nice to know that if any magical crazy thing were to happen to me or, you know, anybody, there's still going to be people all around the world because it is, like y'all said, it's affecting all of us. And it's beautiful to see that there's ways we're going to be able to create community and spread information that will help people stay healthier and potentially get answers and, mitigate anxieties or, finally clear up a lot of the past for some people. And I think that is not only very important for the environment and how we all live and it affects us. I think that's very impactful for the individual, and it's very impactful for somebody's psyche, because it's terrible going your whole life undiagnosed with literally anything and not being able to find answers, and then, not being believed by your doctors. There's so many factors that play into this. And, if there are ways we can even just figure out how to do something slightly better,
we should do it.
Exactly. Because it could at least provide somebody with an answer and potentially save their life.
I agree. And that's why we have Pollution Evolution and why we created it. Because we recognize that these environmental issues are not in a bubble and they're not isolated. And that's why we love having these conversations and having our listeners tune in every week, because, we get to share a new perspective that might not be readily available right now. And with that, I just want to thank you again, Stormy, and you guys can join us next week when we dive into acid rain and we find out why it is raining sulfuric acid. Hallelujah.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Welcome to episode 4.